The marble floors of the Roman palace didn't echo with the footsteps of statesmen discussing policy. They echoed with something far more sinister. Behind the gilded columns and beneath the painted ceilings of what should have been the seat of imperial dignity, a young emperor was orchestrating horrors that would make even the most hardened Roman soldiers turn away in disgust. This wasn't the random madness of a tyrant drunk on power. This was systematic, calculated, and methodically documented cruelty that transformed the very heart of the empire into something unrecognizable. Today, we're examining the 5 most shocking sexual atrocities committed by Emperor Caligula. Violations so disturbing that Roman historians struggled to find words adequate to describe them. These weren't isolated incidents of imperial excess. They were carefully planned operations that revealed the true depths of human depravity when absolute power meets absolute corruption. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the limits of imperial authority and the boundaries of human evil. Before we descend into this darkness, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This channel explores the uncomfortable truths that history often tries to bury, and you won't want to miss what we uncover next. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula because of the miniature soldier boots he wore as a child, began his reign as Rome's golden boy. The people celebrated for 100 consecutive days when he took the throne in 37 CE. After years under the paranoid rule of Tiberius, Romans believed they had finally found their ideal emperor. He was young, charismatic, educated, and connected to the beloved military commander Germanicus. The Senate relaxed, the people rejoiced. No one could have imagined that this charming prince would become the architect of the most systematic program of sexual violence the ancient world had ever witnessed. Caligula's transformation didn't happen overnight. His early months as emperor showed genuine promise. He released political prisoners, reduced taxes, sponsored magnificent public games, and walked freely among the citizens. Women scattered flower petals in his path. Children sang songs celebrating his generosity. The same senators who would later tremble at the sound of his approaching footsteps fought desperately for moments of his attention during those golden early days. Then came the illness that changed everything. In the autumn of 37 CE, a mysterious sickness struck the young emperor down. For weeks, he burned with fevers that court physicians had never encountered. His body convulsed so violently that multiple attendants were required to hold him still. During his delirium, he claimed to be conducting personal conversations with Jupiter himself. Rome held its collective breath, with citizens offering their own lives to the gods if it meant saving their beloved ruler. When Caligula finally recovered, something fundamental had shifted within him. The first signs were subtle, but deeply unsettling. He ordered that every statue of every god throughout Rome should have its head replaced with his own likeness. This wasn't mere vanity, it was the beginning of a psychological transformation that would soon manifest in ways that defied human comprehension. The emperor's physical appearance began to reflect the changes occurring within his mind. His once bright eyes became hollow and predatory, with pupils that remained unnaturally dilated. Sleep abandoned him entirely, and palace servants would discover him wandering the corridors at all hours, whispering to marble statues and responding to voices only he could hear. Dawn often found him naked in the palace gardens, covered in soil, claiming he had been planting the seeds of Rome's destiny. The first atrocity began within his own family, specifically targeting his sisters Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger. What happened behind the palace walls during those early months of his transformation would establish the template for everything that followed. Caligula's relationship with Drusilla became the foundation of his descent into systematic sexual violence. He began calling her his personal Diana and treated her as though she were his empress, seating her in positions reserved exclusively for imperial wives during public ceremonies. When Drusilla died in 38 CE, Caligula's grief transformed into something far more dangerous than mourning. He declared an official period of sorrow so severe that laughter, bathing, and even family meals were forbidden throughout the empire. Citizens who displayed any sign of happiness during this time were executed without trial, but this wasn't the grief of a loving brother. This was the fury of someone who believed that death had stolen his personal property. With Drusilla gone, Caligula's attention shifted to his remaining sisters, and then expanded outward to encompass the wives and daughters of Rome's most prominent families. This is where the systematic nature of his crimes became apparent. What began as personal obsession evolved into something far more sinister, a bureaucratized system of sexual violence that operated with the efficiency of any other government department. The emperor established what he called the imperial cult, a carefully structured program that forced the wives of senators to participate in ritualized acts while he observed from a specially constructed golden throne. These weren't spontaneous outbursts of imperial lust. They were scheduled events, documented in official records, with fees charged and revenues collected. Caligula had discovered how to transform personal depravity into state policy, creating an administrative apparatus designed to institutionalize sexual violence on an unprecedented scale. The palace itself underwent physical transformation to accommodate these new functions. Rooms were redesigned and renamed according to their specific purposes. There was the Chamber of Jupiter, where the emperor cast himself as a living god bestowing divine favors upon his chosen subjects. The Hall of Venus served as a stage for enforced ceremonies that turned noble matrons into unwilling participants in mythological reenactments. Even a space dedicated to Priapus was established, where acts of humiliation were performed against those who had somehow earned the emperor's particular attention. These renovations weren't haphazard modifications. They represented a deliberate effort to transform the seat of Roman government into something resembling a temple dedicated to the emperor's twisted vision of divine authority. Elaborate frescoes decorated these spaces, depicting scenes that would have been considered pornographic in any other context, but were presented here as religious art celebrating imperial divinity. The system that emerged was intricate beyond imagination and horrifying in its efficiency. First came the wives of senators, who were drafted into what Caligula termed his divine service program. These women followed rigid schedules, wore designated uniforms of sheer Syrian silk that left nothing to the imagination, and performed their assigned duties according to carefully maintained timetables. The emperor treated these arrangements as though they were religious observances, complete with ceremonial protocols and ritualistic elements. Next in this hierarchy of horror came the daughters. Girls as young as 12 were gradually introduced into the system under the pretense of receiving divine instruction. But Caligula's ambitions extended far beyond simple exploitation. Secret documents describe what amounted to a selective breeding program, where women judged most suitable were compelled to bear children specifically intended to be raised as imperial dependents. These offspring would be separated from their fathers and trained from infancy to serve the court's particular needs. The record-keeping associated with these activities rivaled that of any legitimate government function. Every conception was noted. Every birth was documented. Every infant death was recorded in the ledgers. The desperate measures taken by women to prevent pregnancy or childbirth became just another statistic for the imperial scribes to catalogue. This wasn't chaos masquerading as governance. This was governance perverted into a tool for systematic sexual violence. Men were not exempt from Caligula's attention. He ordered the feminization of sons from patrician families, dressing them in diaphanous saffron tunics, painting their faces with cosmetics, and teaching them to move and gesture in ways that pleased his particular tastes. These boys were paraded at imperial banquets like exotic entertainment and then auctioned off for private use. The emperor's involvement in these arrangements was rarely about personal gratification. It was about demonstrating that no aspect of Roman society remained beyond his reach or control. The most diabolical aspect of this system was how Caligula forced families to participate in their own destruction. Parents weren't merely witnesses to their children's violation. They became active collaborators, serving as torchbearers in ceremonial processions and signing official contracts that gave legal consent to their wives' and daughters' service to the emperor. The Senate was pressured into passing legislation that provided religious justification for these activities, including one statute that declared the emperor's body sacred and framed any intimate contact with him as a form of worship. This legal framework transformed sexual violence into religious duty and political necessity. It created a bureaucratic structure that made resistance not just dangerous, but technically treasonous. Caligula had discovered something more cruel than physical force, coercive complicity that turned victims into accomplices and families into instruments of their own degradation. The case of Senator Cornelius illustrates the impossible choices faced by Rome's elite during this period. When summoned to surrender his wife Libya for imperial service, Cornelius stood before the Senate and publicly refused. It was an act of remarkable courage that lasted exactly one day. The following morning, his 8-year-old son was discovered on the Senate steps, alive but bearing unmistakable evidence of torture and carrying a message carved into his flesh. That afternoon, Cornelius personally delivered Libya to the palace. Months later, when she conceived by imperial decree, he was forced to acknowledge the child as his legitimate heir, while abandoning any claims from his other offspring. The administration required to maintain this system rivaled Rome's civil government in its complexity and exceeded it in its attention to detail. Hidden clerks maintained meticulous registers in sealed archives beneath the Palatine Hill. Each file followed a standardized template that recorded the victim's name, age, social rank, physical description, specific acts performed, duration of service, apparent degree of cooperation, resulting pregnancies, fees collected, medical examinations conducted, and any injuries sustained during the process. This wasn't simply cruelty for its own sake. It was cruelty as statecraft, violence as administrative policy, and sexual exploitation as a tool of political control. Caligula had created something unprecedented in human history. A government apparatus specifically designed to transform human dignity into a commodity that could be bought, sold, and systematically destroyed through official channels. The true horror of what was happening in Caligula's palace wasn't just the individual acts of violence, though those were terrible enough. It was the transformation of an entire civilization's moral foundation into something unrecognizable, where the institutions meant to protect citizens became the instruments of their destruction, and where the very concept of human dignity was systematically eliminated through bureaucratic procedure. The scope of this administrative nightmare extended far beyond the palace walls, reaching into every corner of Roman society, like a poison seeping through the empire's veins. What made Caligula's system so devastatingly effective wasn't just its brutality, but how it created an entire economy built around human suffering. Vendors appeared overnight, selling specialized ointments and remedies to ease the physical trauma inflicted on victims. Clandestine physicians opened practices focused exclusively on treating the injuries that resulted from imperial attention. Underground apothecaries developed a thriving business providing substances meant to prevent or terminate pregnancies that resulted from these forced encounters. Everyone who touched this system found ways to profit from it, and that profit became the mechanism that ensured its continuation. Greed lubricated complicity at every level of society. Merchants who sold luxury goods to senatorial families knew exactly where the sudden influx of wealth originated. Priests offered blessings for unions that everyone understood had been coerced. Poets composed flowery verses that transformed state-sanctioned violence into mythological glory, creating a literary framework that made the unspeakable seem almost noble. The second atrocity we must examine involves what Caligula termed his lunar fertility rites. These weren't random outbursts of imperial excess, but carefully orchestrated spectacles that occurred on predetermined nights when the moon was full. The emperor had converted a private amphitheatre into what he called his sacred temple, complete with specially designed viewing galleries where husbands and fathers were required to sit while their wives and daughters performed below. These events followed a grotesque protocol that turned human degradation into theatrical performance. Caligula would arrive dressed in elaborate ceremonial robes, carrying a gilded staff topped with phallic symbols that he used to indicate his choices for each evening's activities. He orchestrated every detail like a master of ceremonies, deciding which participants would be paired together, how many would be involved in each scene, and even dictating specific positions and actions using his ceremonial baton. The audience for these spectacles wasn't limited to family members. Caligula invited foreign dignitaries, wealthy merchants, and visiting officials to witness what he presented as demonstrations of Roman divine authority. These guests were expected to applaud and offer commentary as though they were attending a legitimate theatrical performance. The emperor kept detailed notes on who seemed enthusiastic, who appeared reluctant, and who tried to maintain neutral expressions. These observations later became the basis for political promotions, business contracts, and sometimes violent retribution. The participants in these lunar ceremonies weren't limited to human beings. Caligula introduced animals into his spectacles, claiming that the involvement of creatures sacred to various gods added religious legitimacy to the proceedings. Bears trained specifically for these purposes, exotic cats brought from the furthest reaches of the empire, and even specially bred dogs were incorporated into the performances. The emperor justified these additions by referencing mythological stories where gods had taken animal forms to approach mortal women. What made these events particularly horrifying was their bureaucratic precision. Scribes documented everything that occurred, creating official records that treated human suffering like any other administrative function. Names were recorded, duration was timed, and specific acts were catalogued using a coding system that reduced human agony to statistical data. The emperor maintained these records, not just for his personal satisfaction, but as potential evidence against anyone who might later challenge his authority. The third atrocity involves Caligula's implementation of what he called divine succession planning. This program represented perhaps the most coldly calculated aspect of his systematic violence. The emperor had developed an obsession with creating a new generation of Romans who would be entirely dependent on imperial favor from birth. Women who had been forced to participate in his various programs and had become pregnant were monitored throughout their pregnancies by court physicians who reported directly to the emperor. When these children were born, they were immediately separated from their mothers and fathers, regardless of the social status of their families. Caligula claimed these infants as his personal property, declaring that any child conceived through divine service belonged to the state rather than to their biological parents. These babies were raised in special quarters within the palace complex, cared for by nurses who had sworn oaths of absolute loyalty to the emperor. The boys among these children were trained from infancy to serve various court functions, while the girls were prepared for eventual participation in the same system that had destroyed their mothers. This wasn't simply about creating a supply of future victims. Caligula was attempting to engineer an entire generation that would view his practices as normal, natural, and even sacred. He believed that children raised within this system would become adults who would never question the emperor's absolute authority over every aspect of human existence. The education these children received was carefully designed to eliminate any concept of family bonds, personal autonomy, or moral resistance. They were taught that their highest purpose was to serve imperial needs in whatever capacity the emperor deemed appropriate. Religious instruction focused exclusively on the divinity of the emperor, with traditional Roman gods relegated to subsidiary roles in a pantheon where Caligula reigned supreme. Parents who had lost children to this program faced an impossible choice. They could attempt to maintain contact with their offspring and risk being accused of interfering with imperial property. Or they could accept the loss and try to rebuild their lives while knowing their children were being raised to perpetuate the very system that had destroyed their families. Most chose a third option. They simply tried to forget that these children had ever existed, erasing them from family records and refusing to speak their names. The fourth atrocity centers on what Caligula called his purification ceremonies. These events were designed specifically to humiliate and break the spirit of women who had shown any sign of resistance to his system. Unlike the Lunar rites, which followed a predictable schedule, purification ceremonies were announced suddenly and without warning, often in response to some perceived slight or act of defiance. The emperor would select women who had displayed what he interpreted as insufficient enthusiasm during previous encounters, along with new arrivals who needed to understand their place within his system. These ceremonies took place in a specially constructed chamber decorated with religious imagery that depicted various gods engaged in acts of violence and domination. The walls were covered with frescoes showing mythological scenes where divine figures punished mortals who had failed to show proper reverence. During these ceremonies, the selected women were subjected to increasingly elaborate forms of humiliation designed to destroy any remaining sense of personal dignity or autonomy. Caligula would invite groups of palace staff, guards, and even kitchen workers to observe and participate in these events. The emperor presented these gatherings as educational opportunities where witnesses could learn about the consequences of defying divine authority. The psychological impact of these purification ceremonies extended far beyond their immediate victims. Other women within the system learned to display exaggerated enthusiasm and gratitude during their encounters with the emperor, desperate to avoid being selected for purification. This created an atmosphere of competitive degradation where victims tried to outperform each other in displays of apparent willingness, hoping that convincing performances might protect them from worse treatment. Caligula took particular pleasure in forcing mothers and daughters to witness each other's purification ceremonies. He believed that destroying the bonds between parents and children was essential to his broader goal of reshaping Roman society according to his twisted vision. These joint ceremonies often concluded with the emperor forcing family members to express gratitude for the instruction they had received and to pledge their continued devotion to his divine mission. The fifth and perhaps most disturbing atrocity involves what court documents refer to as the emperor's breeding experiments. These activities went far beyond the systematic rape and forced pregnancies that characterized other aspects of his program. Caligula had become obsessed with the idea of creating new forms of human life through controlled reproduction, believing that his divine nature could be passed on to offspring conceived under specific conditions. The emperor established detailed protocols for these experiments, specifying particular combinations of participants, specific timing based on astronomical observations, and even dietary requirements for women selected for breeding purposes. He maintained extensive records documenting the physical characteristics of participants, the conditions under which conception occurred, and the development of resulting pregnancies. Court physicians were required to conduct regular examinations and submit detailed reports on the progress of each experimental pregnancy. Children born from these breeding experiments were subjected to constant observation and measurement as they developed. Palace scribes recorded their physical growth, intellectual development, and behavioral patterns, searching for evidence of inherited divine characteristics. Those children who displayed traits that pleased the emperor were given special privileges and advanced training, while those who failed to meet his expectations often simply disappeared from the palace records. The scientific pretensions surrounding these breeding experiments made them particularly horrifying. Caligula convinced himself that he was conducting legitimate research into the nature of divinity and human development. He corresponded with philosophers and physicians throughout the empire, describing his work in terms that made systematic sexual violence sound like scholarly investigation. Some of these intellectuals actually provided theoretical support for the emperor's activities, creating philosophical frameworks that justified his experiments as necessary steps toward understanding the relationship between divine and mortal nature. These 5 atrocities represent only the most systematically documented aspects of Caligula's reign of terror. Each one reveals how absolute power, when combined with psychological instability and unlimited resources, can create forms of evil that defy human comprehension. The emperor didn't simply commit acts of violence. He created institutional structures that transformed violence into policy, degradation into ceremony, and human suffering into administrative procedure. The most chilling aspect of these atrocities wasn't their individual horror, though that was certainly overwhelming. It was how they demonstrated that entire civilizations could be transformed into machinery for producing and processing human misery, with thousands of people finding ways to profit from and justify their participation in systematic evil. The documentation of these horrors reveals something even more disturbing than the acts themselves: the meticulous bureaucracy that made them possible. Caligula's scribes didn't simply record events for posterity. They created operational manuals that could be referenced, updated, and potentially reproduced. Every violation had its own classification system, complete with subcategories that reduced human agony to administrative terminology. Entry forms were standardized, procedures were codified, and payment schedules were published like any other government rate structure. The emperor charged fees for access to his ceremonies, and these weren't symbolic gestures. The revenues flowed directly into imperial coffers, treated as legitimate state income, alongside taxes and tributes from conquered territories. 16,000 sestertii for a knight to participate with a senator's wife, 2,000 for access to an unmarried daughter, 5,000 for both simultaneously. These prices weren't arbitrary. They reflected careful market research designed to maximize both revenue and psychological impact on the families forced to pay them. Palace accountants maintained ledgers that tracked this income with the same precision they applied to military expenditures or public works projects. The transformation of human dignity into a commodity generated enough wealth to fund significant construction projects, including the expansion of the very chambers where these atrocities occurred. Caligula was literally building his palace of horrors, with money extracted from his victims' families. The physical evidence of this systematic approach survived in fragments that archaeologists discovered centuries later. Hidden beneath layers of subsequent construction, they found rooms with specialized architectural features that served no purpose other than facilitating the emperor's ceremonies. Drainage systems designed to handle specific types of waste, ventilation shafts positioned to carry sounds to designated listening areas, even lighting arrangements that created particular atmospheric effects during evening events. These architectural modifications weren't improvised additions. They represented careful planning by skilled engineers who understood exactly what functions their designs needed to serve. The emperor had commissioned the construction of purpose-built facilities for systematic sexual violence, treating human degradation as an engineering problem that required technical solutions. The psychological warfare embedded within Caligula's system extended beyond his immediate victims to encompass their entire social networks. Husbands who had witnessed their wives' humiliation found themselves unable to maintain normal relationships with their children, who served as constant reminders of what their mothers had endured. Fathers who had been forced to deliver their daughters to imperial service often developed drinking problems or retreated into complete social isolation. The emperor understood that destroying individual victims wasn't sufficient for his purposes. He needed to shatter the social bonds that held Roman society together, replacing traditional family structures with relationships based entirely on fear and submission to imperial authority. Children learned not to trust their parents, who might be forced to sacrifice them at any moment. Parents learned not to love their children too deeply, knowing that affection would only make inevitable loss more painful. This systematic destruction of family bonds created a generation of Romans who had never experienced normal human relationships. Young people who reached adulthood during Caligula's reign had spent their formative years watching their elders submit to degradation and humiliation. They learned that survival required the ability to perform enthusiasm for activities that disgusted them and to maintain smiling facades while witnessing unspeakable horrors. The emperor's attention to psychological detail extended to his treatment of witnesses. He didn't simply force people to observe his ceremonies. He required them to participate actively as audience members, applauding at designated moments and offering commentary on the performances they witnessed. This forced participation transformed passive victims into active collaborators, creating guilt and complicity that made future resistance even more difficult. Caligula developed an elaborate system of rewards and punishments based on the quality of audience participation during his events. Those who displayed appropriate enthusiasm were granted business opportunities, political appointments, or protection for their remaining family members. Those who failed to meet his standards faced increasingly severe consequences, beginning with social ostracism and escalating to physical violence against their loved ones. The emperor's servants and guards became extensions of his psychological manipulation. They were trained to observe facial expressions, body language, and vocal responses during ceremonies, reporting back to Caligula with detailed assessments of each participant's apparent level of cooperation. This surveillance network meant that even private reactions weren't truly private. Everyone understood that their every gesture was being monitored and evaluated. The medical dimensions of Caligula's system reveal perhaps its most coldly calculated aspects. Palace physicians weren't simply treating injuries after the fact. They were conducting preemptive examinations to assess victims' physical capacity for enduring specific types of abuse. Women were evaluated for fertility, pain tolerance, and likelihood of surviving extended mistreatment. These medical assessments were used to create detailed profiles that determined how each victim would be utilized within the emperor's programs. Court doctors developed specialized treatments designed to maximize the duration of victims' usefulness rather than promote genuine healing. Medications that masked pain without addressing underlying injuries. Procedures that restored superficial appearance while ignoring internal damage. Even nutritional programs calculated to maintain victims' strength just long enough to serve the emperor's immediate needs. The emperor's personal physician, a man named Xenophon, left behind encrypted notes that weren't decoded until modern times. His writings reveal the existence of experimental procedures designed to enhance victims' capacity for suffering while prolonging their survival. Chemical compounds that heightened sensitivity to pain. Surgical modifications that made healing more difficult. Even dietary supplements that increased fertility while weakening immune systems. These medical innovations weren't developed in isolation. Caligula corresponded with physicians throughout the empire, sharing techniques and requesting advice on improving his methods. A network of medical professionals contributed to refining the systematic torture occurring within the palace, treating human suffering as a clinical challenge that required scientific solutions. The international dimensions of Caligula's atrocities extended beyond Rome's borders through diplomatic channels. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed his ceremonies were expected to report back to their own rulers about the emperor's demonstrations of absolute power. These reports served multiple purposes. They established Rome's willingness to commit any act in pursuit of its interests. They created fear among potential enemies, and they normalized extreme violence as a legitimate tool of statecraft. Some foreign dignitaries requested private audiences where they could observe Caligula's methods more closely, claiming they needed to understand Roman customs for diplomatic purposes. The emperor welcomed these requests, seeing them as opportunities to export his innovations beyond the empire's boundaries. He provided detailed explanations of his techniques, complete with theoretical justifications that presented systematic sexual violence as a sophisticated form of governance. Archaeological evidence suggests that several client kingdoms began implementing modified versions of Caligula's programs within their own territories. Excavations at sites throughout the former Roman sphere of influence have uncovered architectural features similar to those found in Caligula's palace. along with administrative documents that used terminology directly borrowed from imperial records. The emperor's influence on subsequent generations of rulers extended far beyond his brief reign. Historical documents from various civilizations contain references to techniques that clearly originated in Caligula's palace, adapted to local customs and political structures, but maintaining their essential character as tools for systematic dehumanization. The economic ripple effects of Caligula's system created lasting changes in Roman society that persisted long after his death. Families who had been forced to pay for their relatives' abuse found themselves in desperate financial situations, selling property and borrowing money at ruinous interest rates to meet the emperor's demands. This created opportunities for wealthy individuals who could purchase distressed assets at a fraction of their normal value. An entire class of profiteers emerged around the edges of Caligula's system. Moneylenders who specialized in loans to families facing imperial demands. Merchants who bought property from desperate sellers. Even slave traders who acquired servants whose owners could no longer afford to maintain them. The emperor's atrocities generated wealth for hundreds of opportunists who learned to profit from others' desperation. The psychological trauma inflicted on victims created new markets for services that hadn't previously existed in Roman society. Practitioners emerged who claimed expertise in treating the specific types of mental distress caused by imperial attention. Religious figures developed specialized rituals for purifying individuals who had been contaminated by forced participation in Caligula's ceremonies. These new professions operated in legal grey areas, since acknowledging their necessity would require admitting that imperial activities caused genuine harm. Practitioners developed coded languages and discrete signaling systems that allowed them to offer services without explicitly criticizing the emperor. This underground economy of healing and restoration grew to encompass hundreds of individuals who made their living treating the hidden consequences of systematic abuse. The documentation requirements imposed by Caligula's administration created employment opportunities for scribes, clerks, and archivists who specialized in recording human suffering. These positions offered steady income and relative safety for individuals willing to participate in bureaucratizing atrocity. Many of these employees convinced themselves that they were simply performing administrative functions, avoiding moral responsibility by focusing narrowly on their specific technical duties. The emperor's record-keeping obsession generated volumes of documentation that required secure storage, regular maintenance, and sophisticated indexing systems. Entire departments were established to manage these archives, staffed by individuals who spent their days cataloguing the details of systematic sexual violence as though they were managing any other government database. Years after Caligula's death, these archives became valuable resources for subsequent emperors who wanted to understand the techniques their predecessor had developed. The institutional knowledge embedded in these records ensured that his innovations wouldn't be lost, even if future rulers chose not to implement them immediately. The emperor had created something more durable than personal tyranny. He had established systematic methods for dehumanization that could be studied, refined, and potentially reproduced by anyone with sufficient power and inclination. The most disturbing legacy of Caligula's reign wasn't the immediate suffering he caused, though that was certainly immense. It was the demonstration that entire civilizations could be restructured around the systematic production of human misery, with thousands of people finding ways to participate, profit, and justify their involvement in organized evil. He had proven that atrocity could become policy, degradation could become ceremony, and human suffering could become a sustainable source of both revenue and political control. The machinery he constructed didn't die with him. It simply waited in dormancy, its components scattered but not destroyed, its principles documented and preserved, ready to be reassembled by future tyrants who understood that absolute power requires absolute dehumanization of those subject to it. The mechanisms Caligula developed for tracking his victims reveal the truly systematic nature of his depravity. Palace records show that each woman forced into his service received what amounted to an identification number, carved into small bronze tokens that they were required to wear at all times. These tokens indicated not just their identity, but their specific classification within the emperor's elaborate hierarchy of exploitation. Different metals denoted different categories of service, while symbols etched into the surface indicated particular specializations or restrictions. The emperor's obsession with documentation extended to creating what can only be described as performance evaluations for his victims. Monthly assessments rated individuals on criteria that reduced human beings to livestock being evaluated for breeding purposes. Physical condition, apparent compliance, fertility status, and what the records euphemistically called durability under stress were all scored using numerical systems that palace administrators applied with the same dispassionate precision they might use to evaluate military equipment or agricultural yields. These evaluations weren't simply sadistic record-keeping. They determined everything from meal portions to sleeping arrangements to the frequency of medical examinations. Women who received high marks for compliance were granted small privileges like slightly better food or marginally cleaner quarters. Those who scored poorly faced systematic degradation designed to improve their future performance ratings. The emperor had transformed human suffering into a measurable commodity subject to quality control procedures. The training programs Caligula established for newly inducted victims demonstrate the calculated nature of his approach to psychological destruction. Women weren't simply thrown into his system without preparation. They underwent weeks of conditioning designed to break down their sense of personal identity and replace it with absolute submission to imperial will. This process began with isolation from family members and familiar surroundings, followed by gradual introduction to increasingly degrading requirements. Palace documents describe a curriculum that started with seemingly minor violations of personal dignity and escalated systematically toward complete dehumanization. New arrivals were initially required to perform menial tasks while wearing increasingly revealing clothing. They were forbidden from speaking unless directly addressed by palace staff, and even then only in whispers. Meals were provided at irregular intervals and in quantities just sufficient to maintain basic health without providing comfort. The psychological conditioning included forced participation in religious ceremonies where victims were required to thank the emperor for the privilege of serving his divine needs. These rituals weren't spontaneous expressions of gratitude extracted through violence. They were carefully scripted performances that victims had to memorize and deliver with convincing enthusiasm. Women who failed to display sufficient devotion during these ceremonies faced immediate punishment, while those who excelled received marginal improvements in their living conditions. The emperor's attention to detail extended to creating specialized roles within his system that gave certain victims limited authority over others. Women who had demonstrated complete psychological submission were promoted to supervisory positions where they helped train new arrivals and enforce compliance among their peers. This hierarchy of victimhood served multiple purposes. It reduced the staff requirements for managing the system. It created incentives for victims to compete for marginally better treatment. And it forced participants to become active collaborators in perpetuating their own degradation. The most psychologically devastating aspect of these supervisory roles was how they forced women to inflict on others the same violations they had endured themselves. Former victims became enforcers who taught newcomers the specific behaviors expected during various ceremonies, who reported instances of resistance or non-compliance, and who administered punishments for infractions against palace protocols. The emperor had discovered that turning victims into perpetrators created guilt and complicity that made escape or resistance psychologically impossible. Medical experimentation formed another horrifying dimension of Caligula's systematic approach to human exploitation. Palace physicians conducted research into the physical and psychological limits of human endurance, using victims as test subjects for procedures that had no purpose beyond satisfying the emperor's curiosity about the boundaries of suffering. These experiments were documented with the same clinical detachment that characterized legitimate medical research, complete with hypotheses, methodologies, and conclusions. The emperor was particularly interested in understanding the relationship between physical pain and psychological compliance. Physicians tested various combinations of drugs, physical restraints, and environmental conditions to determine which approaches most effectively eliminated resistance without causing death. The results of these experiments were compiled into reference materials that palace staff used to optimize the effectiveness of punishment and conditioning procedures. The assassination of Caligula on January 24, 41 CE, brought his reign of systematic terror to a violent end, but the machinery he had constructed proved more durable than the man who created it. The conspirators who struck him down in that underground passage weren't motivated by compassion for his victims. They were Praetorian guards who had themselves participated in his atrocities. Their revolt came not from moral awakening, but from personal humiliation at the emperor's hands. Even in death, Caligula's legacy endured through the institutional knowledge preserved in those meticulously maintained archives, the legal precedents established by his complicit Senate, and the thousands of survivors who carried the psychological scars of his systematic dehumanization. His great test achievement wasn't the individual horrors he inflicted, but his demonstration that entire civilizations could be restructured around the bureaucratic production of human suffering. The methods he pioneered, the administrative apparatus, the economic incentives, the psychological conditioning techniques, all remained intact, waiting to be rediscovered and refined by future tyrants who understood that absolute power requires not just the ability to destroy human dignity, but the institutional capacity to make that destruction systematic, profitable, and sustainable.